The sun over the Arizona Territory in 1874 was not a gentle thing. It was a hammer, a forge, an anvil, beating down on the cracked earth until the very air shimmered with a heat that stole the breath. For 3 days. Ruth had walked into its unforgiving glare, and she had come to think of it as a living entity, a merciless God demanding penitence for a sin she had not committed. The sin, in her father's eyes, was defiance. In hers, it was survival. Her world had shrunk to the next step, and the one after that. The fine city dress she had fled in was now a tattered, dust-colored rag, clinging to her skin. The delicate leather of her shoes had been shredded by rock and cactus spine, and she had wrapped her feet in strips torn from her petticoat, which did little to cushion the searing ground. Dust was a permanent resident in her throat, a gritty film on her teeth. It settled in the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes, turning the soft brown of her irises into haunted, desperate pools. She was heading toward the mining town of Redemption, a name so steeped in irony it felt like another form of cosmic cruelty. She'd heard whispers of it back east, a place carved out of the raw wilderness where fortunes were made and lost in the time it took for the sun to cross the sky. More importantly, it was a place where people did not ask questions. A person's past was their own property, to be buried or born as they saw fit. For Ruth, whose past was a pack of wolves at her heels, that anonymity was more precious than any gold that could be pulled from the stubborn earth. The man she was running from, Mr. Alistair Finch, was a man of considerable means and even more considerable appetite. He was her father's business partner, a man with hands that were always too damp and a smile that never reached his cold. Assessing eyes. He was twice her age, with a wife buried not 6 months prior, and he had looked at Ruth not as a woman, but as a new acquisition, a pretty piece of property to complete his estate. Her father, blinded by the promise of a merger that would save their family from ruin, had seen it as a blessing. He had called it her duty. Ruth had called it a cage, and one night, with nothing but a small cloth satchel containing a loaf of bread, a canteen of water, and the last of her mother's jewelry, she had slipped out of her window and run. Now, the memory of that suffocating parlor, with its heavy velvet curtains and the smell of cigar smoke, seemed a lifetime away. Out here, there was only the vast, terrifying emptiness. The landscape was a palette of brown, ochre and rust, broken only by the skeletal arms of saguaro cacti reaching for a sky that offered no relief. It was a land that did not care if you lived or died. It would bake your bones and let the wind scour them clean without a moment's notice. At times, the loneliness was so profound, so absolute, that she would whisper her own name, Ruth, just to hear a human sound, to remind herself that she was still a person and not yet a ghost haunting this desolate expanse. Her water had run out at dawn. The bread was long gone. The hope that had fueled her first 2 days was dwindling, leaving behind the dry, bitter taste of despair. It was then, as her vision began to blur at the edges and her legs trembled with a will of their own, that she saw it. Not a mirage, but a solid, rickety structure squatting in the heat haze. A way station. It was little more than a shack, a scar of human endeavor on the face of the wilderness. But to Ruth, it was an oasis. It was salvation. Summoning the last dregs of her strength, she stumbled toward it. The sound of rough laughter and the tinny plink of an out-of-tune piano reached her before she was at the door. Sounds of life that were both welcome and deeply unsettling. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the warped wooden door. She knew the kind of men who frequented these remote outposts, but thirst was a more immediate and potent threat than any man could be. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The sudden gloom was blinding after the harshness of the sun. The air was thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, stale whiskey, and cheap tobacco. A few men were slumped over tables, and a weary-looking man with a stained apron stood behind a crude bar. But her attention was immediately snagged by a group of 4 men at a corner table. their voices loud and their movements animated by drink. They stopped talking the moment she entered. Every eye in the room turned to her. The piano player's fingers faltered and went still. In that sudden, heavy silence, Ruth felt 100 times more exposed than she had in the open desert. She was a bird with a broken wing that had wandered into a den of coyotes. She kept her eyes fixed on the bartender, her voice a dry rasp. "Water, please." The bartender grunted, reaching for a glass, but one of the men at the table pushed his chair back and stood up. He was a big man with a florid face and a stained duster, a wide, predatory grin spreading across his lips. "Well now, look what the wind blew in," he boomed, his voice slurring slightly. "Ain't you a pretty little thing to be all lost and alone out here?" His companion snickered. Ruth ignored him, her focus a pinpoint on the bartender who was now slowly filling the glass. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. "I asked for water," she repeated, her voice shaking despite her efforts to keep it steady. The big man stepped in front of her, blocking her path to the bar. He was close enough now that she could smell the sour mash on his breath. "We got water. We got whiskey, too. Why don't you come sit with us? Little lady, tell us your story." "I don't have a story," she said, trying to step around him. He moved with her, a lazy, confident motion that was more menacing than any quick aggression. "Oh, everyone's got a story, especially a woman traveling alone in these parts. Running from something, or running to something." Another of the men, leaner and with shifty, rat-like eyes, got up and circled around behind her, cutting off her retreat to the door. "Maybe she's looking for company," he suggested with a wet, unpleasant chuckle. "We can be good company." Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through Ruth. This was it. This was the danger she had been warned about, the one she had prayed she would avoid. Her desperate flight had led her from one cage straight into another. She clutched her small satchel to her chest as if it were a shield. "Please," she whispered, the word barely audible. "Just let me pass." The big man reached out, his thick fingers aiming for a lock of her sweat-dampened hair. "Now, don't be like that." Before his fingers could touch her, a shadow fell across the table. The movement had been so silent, so economical, that no one had noticed him. He had been sitting in the darkest corner of the room, a lone figure nursing a cup of what looked like black coffee. Now he was standing. He was tall, taller than any of the men harassing her, with the kind of lean, hard-muscled frame that spoke of a life lived without excess. His face was weathered by the sun and wind, carved into planes and angles that were neither handsome nor plain, but simply elemental, like a rock formation that had withstood 1,000 years of storms. His eyes, under the brim of a dusty, wide-brimmed hat, were a pale, startling gray, and they held a stillness that was utterly unnerving. He looked at the man in front of Ruth, and he said nothing at all. The big man froze, his hand still in the air. He seemed to shrink a little under that silent, unwavering gaze. He tried to bluster, to regain his footing. "This ain't your concern, friend." The tall man didn't respond. He didn't move a muscle, save for the slow, deliberate lowering of his right hand, which came to rest a few inches from the worn leather grip of the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, a period at the end of a sentence that had not yet been spoken. The air in the room grew thick and heavy, the silence stretched, taut as a wire. The rat-faced man behind Ruth seemed to lose his nerve first, taking a shuffling step back. The other two at the table suddenly found their drinks fascinating. The leader, the big man, held the stranger's gaze for a few more seconds, his face turning a deeper shade of red. He saw no anger in those gray eyes, no challenge. He saw something far more unsettling, a complete and total absence of doubt. It was the look of a man who had already decided how this would end if it went any further, and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. With a muttered curse, the man dropped his hand and stepped aside. "She ain't worth the trouble anyway," he grumbled to his friends, shoving his way back to his table. The spell was broken. The bartender slid the glass of water down the bar, and it stopped directly in front of Ruth. Her hand trembled so badly she had to use both to lift the glass to her lips. She drank the lukewarm, metallic-tasting water in 3 long gulps, the most exquisite thing she had ever tasted. When the glass was empty, she did not look at her tormentors. She looked at the tall, silent man who was still standing there, a sentinel in the gloom. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward the door, then turned and walked back to his corner. Picking up his cup as if nothing had happened, Ruth understood. Leave. Now. She fumbled in her satchel for one of the small silver buttons from her mother's sewing kit to pay for the water, but her fingers were clumsy. She dropped it, and it rolled under a table. Scrambling after it felt like a lifetime of humiliation. When she finally retrieved it and placed it on the bar, she backed away and fled, bursting out of the shack and into the blinding, oppressive heat of the afternoon. She didn't get far. The brief respite, the terror, and the relief had shattered the last of her reserves. She stumbled to the side of the building, her back sliding down the rough-hewn planks until she was sitting in the dirt, drawing her knees to her chest and trying not to sob. She had escaped, but to where? Back into the desert that would surely kill her by morning. A few minutes later, the sound of boots on gravel made her flinch. She looked up and saw him, the tall stranger. He was leading a sturdy-looking bay horse, laden with a bedroll and saddlebags. He walked past her without a glance and began to methodically check the horse's tack, his movements spare and efficient. Ruth watched him, her mind racing. He had saved her. He had done it without a word, without a flourish. He was leaving, and she would be left here, at the mercy of the men inside, or the desert outside. Both were a death sentence. She had run from a cage built by her father. She had nearly fallen into a trap set by brutes. Now, she saw a third option, a terrifying, uncertain, and desperate one, but it was an option. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs unsteady. She walked toward him, her shadow stretching long and thin in the late afternoon sun. He stopped what he was doing as she approached, turning his head to watch her, his gray eyes impassive. He waited. She had to swallow twice before she could find her voice. It came out as a ragged whisper. "Sir." He did not reply, but his stillness was a form of attention. It invited her to continue. I am heading to redemption," she said, the words feeling foolish and small in the vast silence between them. "I have no water, no provisions." She took a breath, the confession of her own vulnerability hanging in the air. "I saw that you were traveling east, the same direction." She paused, her courage failing her. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable. He wasn't helping her. He was making her say it, all of it. Could I travel with you?" The question was a plea. "Just until we reach the town. I won't be any trouble. I can keep up." He looked at her for a long moment. His gaze drifted over her tattered dress, her dust-caked face, the desperation etched into her very posture. He saw everything, the fear, the exhaustion, the flicker of fierce, stubborn pride that refused to be extinguished. For a second, she thought she saw something shift in the depths of his eyes, a flicker of something that wasn't pity, but perhaps recognition. Then it was gone. He finished tightening a strap on his saddle, his movements still unhurried. Then he turned, reached into one of his saddlebags, and pulled out a clean, folded blue bandana. He held it out to her. Ruth stared at it, confused. "For the dust," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones tumbling in a dry creek bed. It was the first time she had heard him speak more than a single word. She took the cloth from his outstretched hand. His fingers brushed hers, and his skin was calloused and warm. It was a simple, practical gesture. "Here's a thing you will need. Take it." But in that moment, it felt like the most profound act of grace she had ever known. It was an answer. Without another word, he swung himself up into the saddle with an easy, fluid motion. He looked down at her one last time, then nudged the horse with his heels, starting off at a slow, steady walk. He did not look back to see if she was following. Ruth tied the bandana over the lower half of her face. It smelled faintly of soap and leather and the clean, dry scent of the desert itself. She took a deep breath, and, for the first time in days, it didn't hurt to breathe. She looked at the broad, silent back of the man moving steadily away from her, a solitary figure against the endless, brutal landscape. And then, she started to walk. They walked into the sunset. The brutal, white-hot glare of the afternoon softened into hues of orange, then lavender and bruised purple that painted the undersides of the few wispy clouds. The heat bled out of the ground, and a chill began to creep into the air, a subtle but persistent thief that stole the day's warmth. Jedediah Boone kept a pace that was steady and unrelenting, his long legs eating up the dry, uneven ground. He never once looked back, yet Ruth felt, with a certainty that defied logic, that he was aware of every step she took, every tired breath she drew. He walked with the quiet purpose of a man who was not merely passing through the land, but was a part of it. As much as the weathered rocks and the thorny mesquite, his horse, which he called Samson, plodded along with equal endurance, its shod hooves making a soft, rhythmic scuffing in the sand. For Ruth, every step was an act of will. The muscles in her legs screamed, and a sharp pain had taken root in her side. But she refused to fall behind. To be a burden was to be disposable, and she could not afford that. This silent, formidable man was her only shield against the wilderness, and she would match his stride until she collapsed. Twice, he stopped. Not for her, but for the horse. He would dismount, run a hand down Samson's legs, and allow him a short drink from one of the canteens, both times, without a word. He offered the canteen to her first. She would take it, her hands trembling slightly, and allow herself only 2 careful swallows, handing it back with a murmured, "Thank you." He would only nod, his gray eyes unreadable, before taking a drink himself and securing the canteen back on his saddle. The shared water was a fragile, unspoken contract between them. When the last of the light had faded and the sky was a deep, velvet black pricked with a breathtaking spray of stars, he finally stopped for the night. He chose a spot nestled in a shallow basin, sheltered on one side by a low mesa of dark rock that would offer some protection from the wind. He slid from Samson's back with practiced ease and began to unsaddle the horse, his movements economical and sure in the deepening gloom. Ruth stood uncertainly for a moment, feeling useless and small. Back home, this was the time of evening when lamps were lit, when the comforting clatter of plates being set for dinner would fill the house. Out here, the silence was a physical presence, broken only by the sighing of the wind across the scrubland and the soft jingle of the harness as Jed worked. She knew she had to do something, anything, to prove her worth. "I can gather wood," she offered, her voice sounding thin in the vast emptiness. Jed paused, a saddle blanket in his hands. He looked over at her, then glanced at the ground around them, strewn with brittle, thorny branches and desiccated brush. He gave another of his small, non-committal nods. It was permission. Her initial forays were clumsy. The branches were sharp and snagged on the tatters of her dress. In the dark, she nearly put her hand on a cactus, snatching it back with a soft cry. After a few minutes of her fumbling, she saw Jed leave the horse and move past her. He didn't speak, but he began to gather wood himself, his process far more effective than hers. He knew what to look for, where to find the driest, thickest pieces. With his boot, he would snap a larger branch into manageable lengths. In less than 10 minutes, he had a respectable pile. He knelt and began to arrange it in the center of their small clearing. Feeling chided, though no word of reprimand had been spoken, Ruth brought her meager collection and added it to the pile. He paid her contribution no mind, his focus entirely on the task at hand. From a small leather pouch, he took a flint and steel, a few sharp, precise strikes, a shower of sparks into a small nest of tinder, a gentle, patient breath, and a tiny flame flickered to life. He nurtured it carefully, adding twigs, then larger sticks, until a proper fire was crackling before them, pushing back the immense, pressing darkness and casting their small camp in a warm, dancing light. He then set a small, blackened coffee pot near the flames and took out a parcel wrapped in oilcloth. It contained hardtack biscuits and several strips of dried jerky. He handed her a biscuit and 2 strips of the meat without ceremony. It was the plainest meal she had ever eaten, but as she bit into the tough, salty jerky, she thought it might be the best. The coffee, when it was ready, was black, bitter, and scalvanizingly hot. She held the tin cup he passed her in both hands, letting the heat seep into her chilled fingers. They ate in silence. Seated on opposite sides of the fire, the flame snapped and popped, spitting embers into the night. A coyote yipped in the distance, its lonely call answered by another, farther away. Ruth watched the man across from her. In the firelight, the hard lines of his face seemed to soften. She could see the fine web of lines at the corners of his eyes, etched there by years of squinting into the sun. She saw the way his jaw worked as he chewed the tough meat, the deliberate, unhurried motion of his hands. He was not a man who wasted movement or words. Her mind, which had been blessedly blank with exhaustion for most of the day, began to stir. The fear that had been held at bay by the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other began to creep back in from the edges of the firelight. Who was this man, Jedediah Boone? He had said, when she'd asked his name hours ago. He hadn't asked for hers in return. He had saved her from those men. Yes, but that did not make him a saint. The West was full of men who were dangerous in different, quieter ways. She was alone with him, miles from anywhere, completely at his mercy. He was bigger than her, stronger by an order of magnitude she couldn't even begin to calculate. He had a gun at his hip and a knife sheathed at his belt. He had offered her no overt kindness, only a stoic, practical brand of assistance that felt as impersonal as the rocks that surrounded them. What if this was all just a slower, more patient kind of trap? She tried to push the thoughts away. She focused on his actions. He had given her his bandana. He had shared his water. He had shared his food. He had not looked at her in the way the men at the way station had. His gaze was direct, assessing, but it was not possessive. It was the look of a man observing a stray dog, trying to decide if it was rabid or simply lost. Still, the fear remained, a cold knot in her stomach. When the meal was finished, Jed rinsed their cups with a splash of water and set them aside. He then unrolled his bedroll, a thick wool blanket, and a canvas tarp on the ground, a respectable distance from the fire, but not so far as to be outside its warmth. He placed his saddle at the head to act as a pillow. He pulled off his boots and set them neatly beside the roll. He was preparing to sleep, and Ruth had nothing. No blanket, no coat. The tatters of her dress would provide no protection against the desert night, which was growing colder by the minute. She watched him, a fresh wave of anxiety washing over her. What was she supposed to do, lie on the bare, cold ground? The thought of the things that crawled in the dark, scorpions, spiders, snakes, made her skin prickle. She drew her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, trying to make herself as small as possible. She would sit by the fire all night if she had to. She would not ask for more than he had already given. She would not be a whining, helpless female. Jed lay down on his bedroll, pulling the blanket up. He settled his hat over his face, and for a long time, he was perfectly still. Ruth thought he must be asleep. The fire burned lower. The shadows grew longer. The wind picked up. a mournful sound that seemed to pull the last of the warmth from her bones. A shiver started in her shoulders, a small, uncontrollable tremor. She tried to suppress it, clenching her teeth, but it only grew stronger, racking her entire body. The silence was broken by his low, gravelly voice, coming from beneath the brim of his hat. He had not been asleep at all. "You'll catch your death of cold." It was a simple statement of fact, devoid of any discernible emotion. Ruth didn't know how to reply. "I'm fine," she lied, her teeth chattering so hard the words were barely intelligible. There was another long silence. Then, with a sigh that seemed to hold the weariness of the entire desert, he sat up. He looked at her, a dark shape against the dying fire, her form trembling visibly. He threw back half of his blanket, exposing the canvas tarp beneath. "Get over here," he said. It was not a request. "Lie down. You'll get more warmth from the ground if you're off it." She stared at the space he had indicated, mere inches from his own body. Her fear and her desperation warred within her. To refuse was foolish, an invitation to illness or worse in the freezing night. To accept felt like a monumental surrender, a crossing of a line that she could not uncross. She thought of Mr. Finch's damp hands, of the leering faces of the men in the saloon. Her experience with men was a catalogue of threats, veiled and overt. But then she thought of this man's utter stillness in the face of those threats. She thought of the cool, clean bandana and the shared cup of water. His actions had spoken a different language than any she had known. Slowly, hesitantly, she got to her feet and crossed the small space between them. She lay down stiffly on the rough canvas, as far to the edge as she could manage without rolling off it. Turning her back to him, the ground was hard and unforgiving beneath her. She was acutely aware of him, of the heat radiating from his body, of the sound of his breathing. The shivering did not stop. If anything, it worsened, fueled now by a potent combination of cold, exhaustion, and a paralyzing, nerve-shredding anxiety. She felt like a tautly wound clock spring, about to shatter into 1,000 pieces. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the tears came anyway, hot and silent against the cold skin of her cheeks. It was all too much. The running, the fear, the loneliness, and now this terrifying, fragile dependency on a complete stranger. A soft, choked sound escaped her lips. Her body shook with a tremor that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the quaking of a soul pushed past its limits. It was the physical manifestation of all her terror and grief. She felt more than heard, him shift behind her. Her entire body went rigid. "What if I shake?" she whispered into the darkness. The question addressed to him, to herself, to the uncaring stars above. It was the most honest thing she had ever said. "What if I fall apart? What if I am too broken to continue?" A moment passed. Then his arm moved, and he didn't touch her, but instead drew the heavy wool of his blanket from his own shoulders and pulled it across hers, tucking it gently around her. His voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble, right beside her ear. It was softer than she had ever heard it, stripped of its harsh, gravelly edge. "Then hold me." The words stunned her. It was not what she had expected. It was not an offer of comfort, not a platitude. It was an instruction, an anchor. He wasn't telling her he would hold her. He was giving her a task, something solid to do in the midst of her own dissolution. "Hold on to me." For a long second, she didn't move. Then, with a slow, trembling motion, she did as she was told. She shifted, turning just enough to let her back rest against his side. She reached back with one hand, her cold fingers finding the coarse fabric of his shirt at his shoulder. She curled her fingers into it, gripping it tight. He was as solid and unyielding as the rock mesa at their back. She could feel the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest with each breath. She could feel the warmth of his body seeping through her thin dress, a deep, living heat that began to push back the chill. He did not wrap his arms around her. He did not caress her hair or whisper soothing nonsense. He simply lay there, a steadfast presence in the dark, allowing her to hold on. She still trembled, but the violent soul-deep shaking began to subside. The tremors became smaller, less frantic. The frantic hammering of her heart began to slow, gradually aligning itself with the calm, even rhythm of his breathing. The wind whispered its lonely song over the rocks, and the fire settled into a bed of glowing embers. The night was vast and silent, filled with a million distant, glittering stars, and for the first time since she had climbed out of her bedroom window, Ruth felt the stirrings of a peace she had thought was lost to her forever. She was holding on to a stranger, and she had never, in her entire life, felt so completely safe. Ruth awoke to a world of soft gray and gold. The stars had retreated, and the first hint of dawn was touching the eastern horizon, outlining the dark mesa in a pale, luminous line. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. The ground beneath her was hard, the air was cold, and there was a heavy weight across her shoulders. Then it came back to her in a rush. The fire, the shivering, the whispered confession, the solid warmth of the man beside her. She was still lying on the edge of his canvas tarp, his wool blanket covering her. Sometime during the night, she had turned, her back no longer pressed against him, but a respectable distance of a foot or so separated them. He was already awake, sitting up with his back against his saddle, a tin cup of coffee cradled in his hands. He wasn't looking at her, but was gazing out at the coming dawn, his profile stark and still. A hot flush of embarrassment crept up her neck. He had witnessed her at her most vulnerable, a trembling, weeping mess. He had shared his bedroll, his warmth, and she felt a mortifying sense of having imposed upon him, of having taken advantage of a kindness she had no right to expect. She sat up slowly, the blanket pooling in her lap. The cold morning air was immediate and sharp. "Good morning," she said, her voice husky with sleep. He turned his head and gave her a slow nod. "Mornin'." He gestured with his cup toward the fire, where the blackened pot was already nestled in the coals. "Coffee's hot." The ordinariness of the gesture was a balm. He was not going to mention the night before. He was treating this new day as just that, a new day. There was no awkwardness in his manner, no hint of condescension. He had seen her break, and now he was offering her coffee, as if the two events were of equal and unremarkable significance. Ruth felt a surge of gratitude so profound it almost brought fresh tears to her eyes. She pushed them back fiercely, determined not to cry in front of this man again. She accepted the cup he poured for her, her fingers wrapping around the hot tin. They drank in their now familiar silence as the sun rose, spilling liquid gold across the desert floor and setting the distant rock formations ablaze with color. The landscape that had seemed so monolithic and threatening in the harsh light of midday was, in the dawn, possessed of a stark and breathtaking beauty. Soon, the spare routine of breaking camp began. Jed moved with an efficiency that was mesmerizing to watch. Every action had a purpose. There were no wasted steps, no hesitation. He saddled Samson, packed the canteens, and doused the fire, scattering the ashes until there was little sign they had ever been there. Ruth did her best to help, rolling the blanket and tarp as neatly as she could, her movements clumsy and uncertain compared to his. He took them from her without comment and strapped them behind his saddle. Within the hour, they were walking again, heading east into the growing warmth of the morning. The character of the land began to change. The flat, sandy basin gave way to a more rugged terrain of rolling hills and winding arroyos carved by ancient, long-forgotten floods. Giant boulders, weathered by millennia of wind and sun, were scattered about like the abandoned playthings of giants. Patches of hardy green scrub clung to life in the shadow of the rocks, and the saguaros were joined by the spidery arms of ocotillo and the pale green trunks of palo verde trees. It was still a harsh, unforgiving land, but it was no longer empty. It felt older, more complex. The silence between them had changed, too. The day before, it had been a silence of uncertainty, of strangers thrown together by circumstance. Today, it felt different. It was a shared silence, a space that existed between them that no longer needed to be filled. Ruth found herself falling into the rhythm of his pace, the sound of her own footsteps in the dirt, a counterpoint to the steady plodding of the horse. She was no longer just following him. She felt as if they were traveling together. By late afternoon, the sun was once again a relentless weight. The dust kicked up by their passage coated her skin and clothes in a fine red powder. It was then that she heard a sound so alien in this dry world that she thought at first she was imagining it. A low, constant murmur, a liquid whisper. Jed stopped, his head tilted. He had heard it too. He changed their course slightly, heading toward a shallow canyon to their left. As they descended, the sound grew louder, accompanied by the rustle of leaves, and then she saw it. A thin ribbon of silver water, flowing over smooth, pale stones. It was a stream, a real, living stream, carving its way through the desert. Along its banks grew a defiant line of green, slender cottonwood trees, their leaves trembling in the slight breeze, and a thicket of willows. The sight and sound of the water were so overwhelming, so miraculous, that Ruth felt a laugh bubble up in her throat. After days of rationed sips from a canteen, this abundance felt like the greatest of luxuries. Jed led Samson to the water's edge, letting the horse drink his fill. Ruth knelt on a flat rock, plunging her hands into the stream. The water was shockingly cold, a delicious balm on her hot, dusty skin. She cupped her hands and drank, the water clean and sweet and tasting of life itself. She splashed it on her face, washing away the grit and grime, feeling some of her humanity return with the simple act of being clean, lost in the simple pleasure of the moment. She pushed the ragged sleeves of her dress up to her elbows, wanting to feel the cool water on her arms. She scrubbed at her hands and wrists, watching the dirt swirl away in the current. It was only when she turned her hand over that she saw it and froze. There, on the pale, tender skin of her inner wrist, was the bruise. It was no longer the angry purple it had been, but had faded to a sickly collage of yellow and green, a ghostly handprint that seemed to mar her skin. It was the mark left by Mr. Finch on the night she had fled, when he had grabbed her wrist in the hallway, his grip like a manacle, his damp breath on her cheek as he'd hissed at her to be a dutiful, obedient girl. The memory washed over her, as cold and shocking as the water. She felt the same old panic, the same feeling of being trapped and sullied. Her immediate, instinctual reaction was shame. She snatched her hand out of the water, quickly pulling her sleeve down to cover the mark, her heart pounding. Her eyes darted around, and she saw Jed. He was standing not 10 feet away, coiling a rope. He was looking right at her. There was no way he could have missed it. In the clear, bright afternoon light, against the paleness of her skin, the bruise would have been as obvious as a brand. Their gazes locked for a fraction of a second. Ruth's breath caught in her throat. She braced herself for the inevitable question. How did that happen? Who did that to you? It was a question that would force her to lie or to relive the humiliation of that night. It was a question that would turn his quiet assistance into pity. And pity was something she could not bear. But Jedediah Boone did not ask. His gray eyes held hers for that brief moment, and in them she saw no curiosity, no judgment, no pity. She saw only a quiet, still watchfulness. And then he simply looked away. He turned his attention back to the rope in his hands, his movements as deliberate and unhurried as ever, as if he had seen nothing more interesting than a ripple in the stream. He had seen, and he had chosen not to speak. He had granted her the dignity of her silence. He had seen her wound and had not forced her to name the weapon that had inflicted it. The lack of a question was a greater kindness than any words of comfort could ever have been. And yet, the moment lingered. As Jed set about making their camp for the evening in the shade of the cottonwoods, Ruth felt a profound and unsettling awareness of herself. The hidden bruise suddenly felt like it was throbbing, a secret that had been unwillingly shared. She withdrew into herself, answering his few practical statements about the fire with monosyllables. She felt fragile, as if the wall she had built around her past had been breached. As dusk settled, a different sort of quiet fell over their camp by the stream. It was heavier than the silence of the open desert, filled with the murmur of the water and the rustle of leaves after their simple meal. Ruth found herself overcome with a bone-deep weariness that was more emotional than physical. The events of the past days, the flight, the terror, the fragile truce with this stranger, the jarring memory of her past had finally caught up with her. She murmured a quiet good night and settled down by the fire, wrapping herself in the blanket Jed had laid out for her without being asked. She fell into a heavy, dreamless sleep almost immediately. Sometime later, she stirred. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the moon was high, casting dappled shadows through the cottonwood leaves. She felt a strange, herbaceous scent in the air, something earthy and green. She opened her eyes, and at first she saw nothing. Then she noticed it. Placed on a flat stone near where she lay, warmed by the residual heat of the fire, was a small, neat pile of crushed green leaves. They looked like plantain leaves, mashed just enough to release their soothing properties. She had seen her mother make a similar poultice for bee stings and scrapes when she was a child. She sat up, her heart giving a strange, slow lurch. She looked over to where Jed was sleeping. He lay still, his hat over his face, a dark, unmoving shape. He must have done this while she slept. He had left the camp, sought out the specific herbs in the fading light, prepared them, and left them for her, all without a single word. He was not offering a cure for the memory that had put the bruise on her wrist. He was offering a remedy for the bruise itself. It was a practical, physical response to a physical wound he had observed. It was his way of saying, "I see that you are hurt," without ever demanding to know the story behind it. It was an acknowledgement without an interrogation. Ruth reached out and touched the crushed leaves. They were cool and slightly damp. A wave of emotion, so powerful and so unexpected it left her breathless, washed over her. It wasn't gratitude. Not simply, it was a feeling of being seen, truly seen. Not as a problem to be solved, or a creature to be pitied, or a prize to be claimed, but as a person with wounds, visible and invisible. She looked from the small pile of herbs to the sleeping man. His silence was not an absence. It was a language all its own, and in that moment, she began to understand it. It was a language of action, of quiet observation, of profound and unwavering respect. She was beginning to believe that true care didn't need words to announce its presence. Sometimes, it was as quiet as a man gathering herbs in the twilight for a wound he would never ask about. 2 days of walking along the stream revitalized them. The water, and the relative abundance of game and forage it provided, transformed their journey. Jed, it turned out, was as skilled with a snare as he was with a gun. He caught 2 plump rabbits, which he roasted over their fire on a spit of green willow wood. For Ruth, who had subsisted on jerky and hardtack, the taste of fresh, savory meat was a revelation. She watched him work, his long, deft fingers skinning and cleaning the animals with a practiced, unemotional efficiency that was both fascinating and a little frightening. He wasted nothing. The poultice of crushed leaves had worked. The ugly bruise on her wrist faded to a pale, ghostly yellow, a phantom of the violence that had put it there. She no longer felt the need to hide it, and he never looked at it again. A new rhythm settled between them. In the evenings, while he cleaned his rifle or mended a piece of tack, she would search the stream bank for edible greens. Her mother's limited lessons in botany surprisingly useful in this new, wild context. She would present her findings to him, and he would inspect them with a solemn eye. discarding a few and nodding at the rest. He would add them to the pot with the rabbit, and they would share a meal that felt less like survival rations and more like a proper supper. They spoke little, but the silence was now a comfortable blanket rather than an empty void. She learned to read his moods by the set of his shoulders or the way he handled Samson's reins. He, in turn, seemed to develop an uncanny awareness of her limits, stopping to rest just before her exhaustion became overwhelming, always finding a campsite with shelter and water before the sun went down. She was no longer just a refugee he had reluctantly taken on. She was a traveling companion. The knowledge was a small, warm coal glowing in the center of her chest. On the 5th day of their journey together, the landscape began to flatten out, the rugged hills giving way to a wide, dusty plain. In the distance, she could see a dark line on the horizon, a smudge of human activity against the vastness of the sky. "Town," Jed said, his first unsolicited word of the morning. "Prosperity Wells, we'll get supplies." Prosperity. Wells was a generous name for what was, in reality, a handful of weathered, unpainted buildings huddled together as if for protection against the endless expanse of dust and sky. There was a single, wide main street, rutted by the passage of wagon wheels, a general store, a blacksmith's forge belching dark smoke, a saloon with bat-wing doors that swung listlessly in the breeze, and a livery stable comprised the whole of its commercial heart. A few scattered houses, little more than shacks, completed the town. It was a place built for purpose, not for comfort, a temporary stop on the way to somewhere else. But after days in the wilderness, its humble, dusty presence felt like a bustling metropolis to Ruth. Jed reined Samson in at the livery. "I'll get grain for the horse and stock up at the store. Water the horse. Wait here, inside." It was a string of commands, delivered in his usual clipped, factual tone. Ruth nodded. Taking the reins as he swung down, he strode off toward the general store, his long-legged gait covering the ground quickly, a solitary, imposing figure that seemed to part the sparse foot traffic of the street. Ruth led Samson into the cool, dim interior of the stable. The air was rich with the familiar, comforting smells of hay, leather, and horse. An old man with a face as wrinkled as a dried apple sat on a stool, braiding a leather strap. He looked up, gave her a toothless grin, and pointed to an empty stall in the water trough. "Help yourself, miss," he said, his voice a reedy cackle. She thanked him and led Samson to the trough, letting the horse drink his fill. The simple, domestic task was grounding. For a few minutes, she could almost pretend she was a normal person in a normal town, just tending to a horse. She found a curry comb hanging on a peg and began to work on Samson's dusty coat, her movements slow and rhythmic. The horse sighed, a great gust of warm air, and leaned into her touch. The repetitive motion was soothing, and for the first time in a long time, a fragile sense of peace settled over her. She was safe. The fear was a thing of the past, a ghost she had left behind in the desert. "Well now, if it ain't the little desert rose." The voice was like a bucket of ice water down her spine. It was greasy, insinuating, and horribly familiar. Every muscle in her body locked. The curry comb slipped from her numb fingers and clattered onto the packed dirt floor. The fragile piece shattered into a million sharp-edged pieces. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, she turned. Leaning against the wide-open doorway of the stable, silhouetted against the bright, dusty street, was one of the men from the way station. It was the lean one, the one with the shifty, rat-like eyes and the unpleasant, wet smile. He looked dirtier than she remembered, and his eyes, as they roamed over her, were filled with a nasty, triumphant gleam. He had found her. The wolves had picked up the scent again. "Figured you'd turn up somewhere," he said, pushing himself off the doorframe and taking a step into the stable. The old liveryman looked up, his eyes wide, and then suddenly became intensely interested in a knot in his leather strap, shrinking into himself. "Your big friend ain't with you," the man observed, his eyes darting around the stables. "Left you all alone. Did he can't say I'm surprised? A man like that, he don't keep company for long." Ruth's mind was a maelstrom of white-hot panic. Her throat closed up, and her lungs seemed to forget how to draw breath. She backed away, her hand finding Samson's warm, solid flank. The horse shifted uneasily, sensing her terror. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs were rooted to the spot, turned to lead. The trembling started again, a violent, uncontrollable quake that began in her knees and spread through her entire body. The man, whose name she now recalled the others calling Eli, saw her fear, and his grin widened. He took another slow, deliberate step toward her. He was enjoying this, savoring it. "Me and the boys, we were real disappointed when you ran off with him. Left a bad taste in our mouths," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But maybe you just made a bad choice. Maybe you'd like some real company now. Company that knows how to treat a lady." He was close now, only a few feet away. The sour smell of him reached her, and she flinched. Her back was pressed against the rough wood of the stall. There was nowhere left to run. This was it. The nightmare she had been fleeing had caught up to her, here in this dusty, indifferent town. Just as Eli took another step, a shadow fell across the entrance, blocking out the harsh afternoon sun. Ruth's eyes, wide with terror, flickered past Eli's shoulder. It was Jed. He stood just inside the doorway, a burlap sack of supplies in one hand. He had moved so silently, she hadn't heard him approach. He took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance, the rat-faced man advancing. Ruth pressed against the stall, her body shaking, her face a mask of pure terror. His expression did not change. His face could have been carved from stone, but something happened in his eyes. The cool gray seemed to flash, to harden, to become chips of winter ice. He set the sack of supplies down on the ground, the motion unhurried, almost casual. Eli, startled, spun around. "Whoa there, friend. This here is a private conversation." Jed ignored him. His eyes were fixed on Ruth. "Go inside," he said, his voice low and flat, but carrying an unmistakable command. "Back of the stall, now." For a second, she couldn't move. Then the command penetrated her panic. She scrambled sideways, past Samson's rear, and squeezed herself into the narrow space at the back of the stall, pressing her body into the corner. From the shadows, through a gap between the wooden slats, she could see the scene in the main part of the stable. Jed took a single step forward, placing himself directly between Eli and the stall where she was hiding. He was a wall, a fortress. Eli tried to regain his swagger, but it came out as a weak bluster. "Now see here, this ain't none of your business. Me and the lady were just talking." "You have no business in this town," Jed said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of finality. He was not arguing or threatening. He was telling Eli how things were. Eli puffed out his chest. "And who are you to tell me my business? You ain't the law." "No," Jed agreed, his voice still unnervingly calm. "I'm not." And then he moved. It was not a large movement. It was almost imperceptible. He simply let his right hand, which had been hanging at his side, fall a few inches, his fingertips coming to rest just above the worn, smooth grip of the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip, his thumb hooked lightly over his belt, inches from the hammer. That was all. He did not draw. He did not issue a challenge. He simply made his readiness known. The air in the stable became thick and suffocating. The lazy afternoon sounds from the street, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the distant laughter from the saloon seemed to fade away into nothing. There was only the tense, humming silence between the two men. From her hiding place, Ruth watched, her breath held tight in her chest. She saw the change in Eli's face. The greasy confidence evaporated, replaced by a sheen of sweat on his upper lip. His shifty eyes darted from Jed's cold, flat gaze down to the hand resting near the gun, and then back up again. He saw no anger in Jed's face. Anger was a thing you could negotiate with, a fire that might burn itself out. What he saw was far worse. He saw a complete, desolate absence of feeling. He saw the serene, absolute certainty of a man who was not considering violence, but was simply acknowledging its arrival, like a farmer acknowledging a coming storm. Eli swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thin throat. He was a predator, but a cowardly one. He preyed on the weak, the isolated, the terrified. He was not equipped for this. He was not prepared to die in a dusty stable over a woman he had only just found again. He tried to salvage a scrap of dignity. He laughed, a short, ugly, unconvincing bark. Pah, this town's a bust anyway. Nothing here for me. He took a step back, then another, his eyes never leaving Jed. You can have her. She's probably more trouble than she's worth. He turned and practically fled from the stable, stumbling out into the bright sunlight and scurrying down the street, a rat disappearing back into the woodwork. Jed did not move. He stood perfectly still, his hand still resting near his gun, and watched until Eli had vanished from sight. Only then did he seem to relax, the tension flowing out of his shoulders. He turned, his boots silent on the dirt floor, and came to the stall door. He did not say, "Are you all right?" He did not offer any words of comfort. He simply stood there, his presence filling the doorway. Ruth was still pressed into the corner, shaking so badly her teeth chattered. The terror had passed, leaving in its wake a tidal wave of reaction, and something else, something new and overwhelming. She looked at him, at his tall, solid frame, at the man who had faced down her nightmare without raising his voice, without throwing a punch. He had simply stood. He had stood between her and the thing she feared most in the world. Her father had tried to sell her. Mr. Finch had tried to own her. The men at the way station had tried to take her. They had all been forces acting upon her. But Jedediah Boone had placed himself in front of her. He had become her shield. The realization was so profound, so utterly earth-shattering, that it broke something loose inside of her. A single hot tear spilled from her eye and traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. Then another, and another. They were not tears of fear or of sadness. They were tears of a strange, aching, and utterly foreign relief. It was the release of a lifetime of holding her breath, of always looking over her shoulder. For the first time, someone had stood, and in his stillness, in his quiet, deadly calm, he had given her something she didn't even know she had been starving for protection, freely and completely offered, without a single word. They left Prosperity Wells without a word. Jed loaded his supplies, helped Ruth onto Sampson's back, and then took the reins himself, leading the horse out of town at a steady walk. Ruth, perched on the saddle, felt a profound sense of detachment, as if she were watching herself from a great distance. Her tears in the stable had been a storm, and what was left was a strange, hollow calm. She had been found, and she had been saved. The two facts were so immense, she could not yet make sense of them. She expected him to continue east, toward the mining town of redemption that had been her original, desperate goal. But as the dust of Prosperity Wells settled behind them, Jed turned Sampson north, into a different quadrant of the wilderness. He was leading them away from the known trail, into a landscape of rolling, grassy hills dotted with juniper and pine. Ruth did not question it. The confrontation in the stable had changed the foundation of their arrangement. She was no longer a desperate woman begging passage from a stranger. He was no longer a man merely offering a temporary escort. He had stood for her. He had claimed a responsibility for her safety. And now, wherever he was going, she would follow. Trust was no longer a fragile, intellectual decision. It had become a simple, physical fact, as real as the solid warmth of the horse beneath her. For 2 days they traveled north, climbing steadily into a higher elevation. The air grew cooler, cleaner. The oppressive heat of the low desert was replaced by a pleasant warmth during the day and a crisp, clean chill at night. They saw herds of pronghorn antelope flowing like water over the hills, and once, the distant, tawny shape of a mountain lion sunning itself on a high rock. It was a land that felt more alive, more forgiving. Late on the second day, they entered a wide, shallow valley, a green sanctuary carved between two gentle, pine-studded mountains. A clear, fast-running creek bisected the valley floor, and the grass grew thick and tall. It was a place that felt protected, hidden away from the harsh realities of the world they had just left. In the center of this valley, nestled in a grove of cottonwood trees, was the ranch. It was a simple, sturdy-looking homestead, built of dark, notched logs, chinked with dried mud. There was a main cabin with a wide stone chimney, a large barn, and a series of corrals, their fences askew but mostly intact. The place was deeply neglected. Weeds grew waist-high, threatening to swallow the buildings whole. The cabin's porch sagged on one side, and several shingles were missing from the roof, leaving dark, vulnerable patches. It was a place that had been built with love and strength, and then abandoned to the slow, relentless reclamation of nature. It was a ghost of a home. Jed stopped Samson at the edge of the property and stood for a long time, just looking. Ruth slid down from the horse's back, her own eyes taking in the scene. She could feel a profound silence here, deeper than the silence of the desert. It was the silence of absence, of lives that had once been lived within these walls and were now gone. Jed's shoulders, usually so straight and rigid, seemed to slump slightly. He walked forward, his boots sinking into the overgrown grass, and rested a hand on the gatepost of the main corral. His calloused fingers traced the deep gouges of a carving in the wood. "My brother, Caleb, and we built this place," he said, his voice softer and rougher than she had ever heard it. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The simple statement was heavy with a history of shared labor, of hope, and of a loss so profound it still echoed in the quiet valley. This was not just an abandoned ranch. It was a wound. That evening, they did not camp outside. Jed pushed open the groaning door of the cabin and they stepped into the dusty, stale air inside. The interior was a single large room, with a cavernous stone fireplace dominating one wall. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center, coated in a thick layer of dust. A few simple shelves were on the wall, empty save for a rusted tin cup. Cobwebs, thick and intricate as lace, hung from the rafters. Their first task was to make the place livable, while Jed used a broken fence rail to clear the chimney of a bird's nest. Ruth found an old broom in a corner and began the monumental task of sweeping. She swept away years of dust, of dried leaves that had blown in under the door, of the tiny bones of mice and the desiccated husks of insects. With every stroke, it felt as though she were sweeping away not just the dirt, but the neglect, the sadness that clung to the air. By the time Jed had a small, cautious fire crackling in the hearth, Ruth had cleared a space in the center of the room. The firelight pushed back the gloomy shadows, filling the cabin with a warm, flickering glow. It was the first time in what felt like a lifetime that she had stood under a solid roof, with a fire in a hearth, and the feeling of security it brought was so potent it was almost overwhelming. They ate their simple meal of beans and bacon at the dusty table, the silence comfortable, the work of the coming days hanging unspoken between them. The next morning, the work of reclamation began in earnest. Their days fell into a new rhythm, one of shared constructive labor. The first priority was water. The well outside the cabin had a solid stone lining, but the hand pump was rusted solid. Jed, with a quiet determination, took it apart piece by piece, cleaning the mechanisms with oil and a rag from his saddlebags. while Ruth hauled bucket after bucket of water from the creek to fill the cistern. Her muscles ached, and her hands, soft from a life of needlepoint and piano keys, grew calloused and sore. But it was a good ache, the ache of purpose. They worked on the roof next. It was Jed's domain, but it required 2 people. He would climb up, as sure-footed as a mountain goat, and call down to her, telling her what he needed. She became his ground crew, finding the best of the fallen shingles, passing him the hammer, holding the makeshift ladder steady. She learned the language of his work, the sharp, definitive sound of a nail being driven home, the scraping sound of a rotten shingle being pried loose, the low grunt of satisfaction when a patch was complete. In the evenings, the cabin became her domain. While Jed tended to Samson or repaired a section of fence, she took their meager supplies and transformed them into meals. Cooking in a real fireplace was a world away from a campfire. She found a heavy cast-iron Dutch oven left behind in a corner, and after scrubbing it clean in the creek, she learned to bake a passable cornbread in the coals. She foraged for wild onions along the creek bed, adding them to their stews. These small domestic acts were a balm to her soul. She was not just a survivor anymore, she was a homemaker, contributing to the creation of a sanctuary. One afternoon, while clearing the thick brush that had overgrown the path to the barn, they made a discovery. Tucked away in the farthest, most sheltered corner of the barn was a small, determined flock of chickens. They were descendants of the original flock, gone half wild, but they had survived, scratching a living from insects and seeds. And one of them, a small, mottled brown hen with impossibly bright, aggressive eyes, was fiercely protective of a clutch of eggs she had hidden in a nest of straw and weeds. A few days later, Ruth was mending a tear in her dress. Sitting on the newly repaired porch step and enjoying the late afternoon sun, Jed was coming from the corral, his long strides eating up the ground, his mind clearly on the section of fence he was planning to fix next. He was not looking at the ground. He did not see the small brown hen. He walked right past her hidden nest. The hen exploded out of the tall grass in a furious, squawking flurry of feathers and indignation. She launched herself at Jed's boots, pecking and flapping with the righteous fury of a mother defending her young. Jed stopped, utterly startled, looking down at the tiny, feathered demon attacking his ankles. He took a step back, a look of profound confusion on his face. The hen, emboldened, pressed her attack, her squawks reaching a fever pitch. Jed took another, longer step back. The hen gave a triumphant squawk and charged again, chasing him. And that is when Ruth saw at the sight of this tall, silent, formidable man, the man who had faced down drunkards and bullies with nothing more than a cold stare. The man who was more at home in the wilderness than any person she had ever met being put to a full, undignified retreat by a chicken that weighed no more than 3 pounds. A strange sound bubbled up in her chest. It started as a giggle, a sound so foreign she barely recognized it. She pressed her hands to her mouth, trying to stifle it, but it was no use. The sight of Jed taking another hasty step backward as the hen flapped menacingly was too much. The giggle burst forth, transforming into a full, clear peal of laughter. It was a sound of pure, unalloyed joy. It filled the quiet valley, echoing off the side of the barn. It was a sound that had been absent from her life for so long she had forgotten what it felt like. It felt like sunshine. It felt like cool water. It felt like being alive. The sound of her laughter stopped Jed in his tracks. The hen, sensing a shift in the dynamic, gave one last victorious peck at his boot and strutted back toward her nest, clucking with self-importance. Jed was no longer looking at the chicken. He was looking at her. He stood there in the middle of the yard, watching her as her laughter slowly subsided into quiet, breathless chuckles. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. But she saw the hard, stoic lines of his face soften. The cold, watchful defense in his gray eyes seemed to melt away, replaced by something quiet and warm. and deep. It was a look of gentle wonder, as if he were seeing the sun rise for the very first time. He held her gaze for a long moment, and in that shared look, something shifted. The last of the fear, the last of the sorrow that had been her constant companions, seemed to break apart and drift away on the warm afternoon breeze. The ranch was no longer a place of ghosts and loss. It was a place of work, of healing. It was a place where laughter could exist. It was beginning to feel like home. The laughter changed the valley. Before, the silence had been one of nature and neglect. Now, it was punctuated by a new, human resonance. It lingered on the porch where Ruth had sat. It seemed to cling to the air around the barn where the furious hen still guarded her nest. It had altered the space between Ruth and Jed, replacing the fragile truce of strangers with the easy, unspoken familiarity of partners. The work continued, but it felt different. There was a lightness to it. They cleared the main room of the cabin completely, scrubbing the floorboards with sand and creek water until the pale, clean scent of the wood filled the air. Jed, using an old axe head he'd found and a new handle he carved from a piece of hickory, squared up the sagging door frame until the cabin door shut firmly for the first time in years. The solid thunk of the wood, a deeply satisfying sound. Ruth found a small crate of her own, while Jed worked on the larger structures. She focused on the details that turn a shelter into a home. She washed the single tin cup and the few remaining plates until they shone. She gathered wildflowers from the valley floor, purple lupine, fiery Indian paintbrush, and delicate white daisies, and arranged them in a chipped ceramic jug she found on the mantelpiece. The splash of color against the dark logs was a defiant statement of life and hope. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire in the great stone hearth. The nights were growing cooler as autumn began to lay its gentle hand on the high country. The flames were a living presence in the cabin, painting the walls with dancing shadows, chasing away the chill and the deep, dark loneliness of the wilderness. It was in these quiet hours that Ruth felt the last of her old life's anxieties begin to truly recede. The fear of being found, which had been a constant, humming wire in the back of her mind, had been severed in the livery stable at Prosperity Wells. Jed had not just scared Eli away. He had broken the spell of her fear. One evening, the air was particularly still and cold. A brilliant, full moon hung in the sky, so bright it silvered the tops of the pine trees on the surrounding mountains. Jed was sitting on a low stool he had repaired, sharpening the blade of a small skinning knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic, scraping sound was the only noise in the cabin, a steady, meditative rhythm. Ruth sat on the floor, her back against the warm stones of the hearth, watching the flames. The firelight mesmerized her. In the shifting shapes of the orange and red embers, she saw pictures. She saw the heavy velvet curtains of her father's study. She saw the glint of light on Mr. Finch's polished shoes. The warmth on her back was a comfort, but the memories stirred by the flames brought a different kind of chill. She had given him nothing of herself. He knew her only as Ruth, a woman he had found in the desert. He had shared his food, his water, his blanket, and had stood between her and danger. He had given her this sanctuary, a place that was so clearly steeped in his own pain, and asked for nothing in return. The imbalance of it felt like a debt she could never repay, a secret that was a barrier between them. However comfortable their shared silence had become, the safety he had built around her had become so absolute that it finally made room for the truth. "My father," she said, her voice quiet, barely more than a whisper. The rhythmic scraping of the whetstone stopped. Jed did not look up immediately. He drew the knife blade one last, long, slow time across the stone, then wiped it clean on a piece of leather. Only then did he lift his head, his gray eyes finding hers in the firelight. He did not speak. He simply waited. His stillness was an invitation, an empty vessel waiting to be filled. "My father is a merchant," she began, her voice gaining a little strength. "He deals in fine textiles, silks from the East, wool from England. He loves beautiful things. He sees the world as a ledger of assets and liabilities. She paused, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. He came to see me as an asset. She told him about the failing business, about the investments that had soured, about the quiet desperation that had begun to creep into their grand house, a chill that no fire could warm. And she told him about Alistair Finch. She described his damp, soft hands, the cloying scent of the bay rum he wore, the way his eyes would linger on her neck, her wrists, as if he were assessing a horse he was considering for purchase. My father called it a brilliant match, a merger, Mr. Finch was a widower, a man of considerable wealth. He would save our family. He would save my father's name. And all it would cost was me. She looked down at her hands, twisting a loose thread on the cuff of her worn dress. I tried to refuse. I begged him. I told him I did not love Mr. Finch. I told him I feared him. My father did not understand. He said love was a luxury, a romantic notion for poets. He spoke of duty, of family. He said I was being selfish, ungrateful. He said I was his daughter, and I would do as I was told. Jed remained motionless, his hands resting on his knees. He was no longer a man sharpening a knife. He was a witness. His entire being was focused on her, his attention a palpable force in the room. The night before the engagement was to be announced. Mr. Finch came for dinner. He brought me a gift, a silk shawl. It was beautiful, the color of a twilight sky. He draped it over my shoulders himself. His fingers brushed against my neck, and I felt unclean. Later that evening, in the hall, he caught my arm. Her hand went to her wrist, the one that had been bruised, though the mark was long gone. The memory, however, was not. He told me he was looking forward to our life together. He said he would teach me the obedience a wife owed her husband. He smiled when he said it. His grip was very strong. She took a shaky breath, the memory of that moment, the feeling of utter powerlessness, constricting her chest. That night, I knew I could not do it. I could not become another one of my father's beautiful things, locked away in a house with a man whose touch made my skin crawl. I could not live a life that was not my own. It felt like a death sentence, a slow, suffocating death. She described the escape, her movements a frantic, silent ballet in the sleeping house, slipping out of her room, a ghost in her own home. Taking only the small cloth satchel with the last of her mother's things, a woman who had died quietly and obediently years before. She spoke of the paralyzing fear that had seized her as she stood in the shadows of the garden, looking back at the house, the weight of her betrayal, of her defiance, settling on her like a physical shroud. She had a destination in mind, redemption, but no real plan. Her only guide was a desperate, primal need to run, to put as much distance as possible between herself and the cage that was closing around her. I just walked, she whispered, her voice cracking. I walked until the city was gone, until the fields were gone, until there was nothing but the desert. I thought if I could just get far enough away, I could outrun his memory. I could outrun my father's disappointment. I could outrun the shame of what I had done. When she finished, a profound silence filled the cabin. The only sound was the soft crackle and pop of the fire. She had laid her entire, pathetic story at his feet. The story of a disobedient daughter, a coward who had run from her obligations. She felt hollowed out, empty, and deeply, terribly cold. She expected him to say something, to offer judgment or pity, or perhaps just to get up and walk away. Disgusted by her weakness, she kept her eyes fixed on the fire, unable to meet his gaze, bracing herself. He did not speak. Instead, he rose from his stool, his movements slow and deliberate. He went to the hearth and, using a small piece of wood, he nudged several smooth, flat stones from the edge of the fire onto the stone lip of the hearth. They were not glowing hot, but they had absorbed the deep, steady warmth of the fire. He watched them for a moment, then went to his saddlebags, which lay in a corner. He rummaged inside and pulled out a small, folded square of clean linen, a spare kerchief. She realized, much like the one he had first given her. He returned to the hearth, carefully wrapped the warm stones in the clean cloth, and then he knelt in front of her. He did not touch her. He simply held out the small, warm bundle. Ruth looked at it, then up at his face. In the firelight, his expression was serious, his gray eyes holding a deep, unreadable gentleness. She slowly, hesitantly, held out her hands, and he placed the bundle in her palms. The warmth was immediate and profound. It was a solid, tangible thing, a living heat that seeped into her cold skin, up her arms, and into the very center of her chest, pushing back the chill that her memories had left behind. It was an anchor in the turbulent sea of her emotions. She closed her fingers around it, clutching it to herself. It was such a simple, practical gesture. Her hands were cold, so he had warmed them, but it felt like so much more. It was an answer without words. It was comfort, offered without condition. It was acceptance. She finally found the courage to look him in the eye and to ask the question that had been haunting her since the day she'd run, the question that defined her shame. Her voice was a thread of sound. "You don't hate me for running." He looked at her, and the gentle expression in his eyes did not waver. He considered her question with the same solemn gravity he gave to everything. Then he shook his head, a small, slow movement. "No," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. He leaned a little closer, and what he said next was not a judgment, not an opinion, but a truth, simple and profound. That would change the way she saw herself forever. "You kept breathing. That's brave. You kept breathing. That's brave." The words had settled into the quiet places of Ruth's heart, not with a crash, but like the first gentle snow of winter, covering the hard, frozen ground of her past with a soft, clean blanket of acceptance. In the morning light, nothing and everything had changed. The work was the same: water from the creek, wood for the fire, the endless task of pushing back the wilderness, but the silence that accompanied it was different. Before, it had been a space defined by what was unsaid. Now, it was a space filled with what was understood. She found herself watching him with a new kind of attention. She watched the way his hands, which could be so hard and capable when fixing a fence or handling a horse, could also be surprisingly gentle, like when he reset a loose stone in the hearth without crushing the moss that grew beside it. She watched the way he would pause sometimes, his gaze fixed on the high peaks to the east, a look of such profound and lonely stillness on his face that it made her own chest ache in sympathy. He was a man made of the same materials as the landscape around them, quiet, resilient, and holding a history of storms she could only guess at. His bravery was in his stillness, in his endurance. Hers, he had told her, was in her breath. The idea was so revolutionary, so contrary to the narrative of failure and shame she had carried for so long, that it had begun to remake her from the inside out. Running was not her defining feature. Surviving was. A few days after her confession, a warm, unseasonable wind blew up from the south, carrying with it the last sweet scent of summer. It was a restless wind, a wind of change. It stirred the golden leaves of the cottonwoods and sent them spinning through the air like coins. It made the tall grasses of the valley sway and whisper. It got inside Ruth and stirred a feeling of restlessness in her, too. A need to do something, to say something that her simple words of thanks could not convey. That afternoon, she left the cabin with a small basket she had woven from willow branches. She walked away from the homestead, following the creek as it wound its way deeper into the valley. The world was awash in the soft, golden light of late afternoon. She walked with a purpose she had not felt before, a sense of belonging in this wild, beautiful place. It was no longer a refuge from a threat. It was simply home. She gathered flowers, not with the polite, curated precision of a city woman arranging a bouquet for a parlor, but with the heartfelt gratitude of someone seeing color for the first time. She chose the last of the season's Indian paintbrush, their tips a fiery, defiant red. She found clusters of purple asters growing in the shade of a large boulder, their petals the color of the twilight sky she had once so feared. She added the sunny, cheerful faces of black-eyed Susans and, for texture, the soft, silvery leaves of a sagebrush, which released a clean, sharp scent when she crushed a leaf between her fingers. It was a wild, untamed collection of colors and scents, a perfect reflection of the land itself. It was a bouquet of survival. Each bloom was a testament to the life that could flourish in this hard country, a life that, like her own, had kept breathing. She returned to the homestead as the sun began to dip behind the western mountains. Jed was in the corral, working with Samson, his low voice a gentle murmur as he ran a brush over the horse's flank. She did not want to interrupt him. This was a private conversation, a thank you that needed no audience. She went to the barn, the place where he had stood between her and Eli, the place where her fear had finally broken and given way to tears of relief. The great, weathered wooden doors stood slightly ajar, with a reverence that felt almost holy. She placed the bundle of wildflowers on the ground, leaning it carefully against the doorpost, a splash of vibrant color against the gray, aged wood. She did not leave a note. The gesture was the message. It was for the unspoken kindnesses, the blanket on that first cold night, the herbs for a wound he never questioned, the patient silence that had allowed her to speak her truth. It was for the way he had stood, a silent wall, in the stable at Prosperity Wells. It was for the 6 words that had given her back to herself. She retreated to the cabin and began to prepare their evening meal, her heart beating a little faster than usual. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a new way. It was one thing to confess her past. It was another to offer a piece of her present, a piece of her new, fragile, and hopeful self. An hour later, as the sky deepened to indigo and the first stars began to prick the darkness, Jed came back from the corral. He usually came straight to the cabin, but this time he did not. From the open cabin door, Ruth could see him stop. He stood before the barn, his tall frame silhouetted against the last of the light. He had seen the flowers. He stood there for a long time, perfectly still. Then he knelt, his movements slow, almost cautious. He reached out and picked up the bouquet. He did not bring it to his nose to smell it. He simply held it in his large, calloused hands, looking down at the wild, vibrant collection of petals and leaves. From the distance of the cabin porch, Ruth watched, her breath caught in her throat. She saw his thumb, rough and scarred from a lifetime of hard labor, gently stroke the soft, velvety petal of a purple aster. It was a gesture of such unexpected tenderness, such quiet contemplation, that it made her heart ache. This man, who lived in a world of leather and steel, of horses and guns, was holding a handful of fragile, useless beauty as if it were something precious, something he needed to understand. He was a man of action, and she had given him a thing of stillness. He was a man of practicality, and she had given him a thing of sentiment. He stayed there, kneeling in the dirt, for what felt like an eternity. He was turning the bouquet over in his hands, examining it from all angles. He was not just looking at it, he was reading it. He was reading the gratitude, the acknowledgement, the tentative offering of a soul that was beginning to heal. Finally, he rose to his feet, still holding the flowers. He did not take them into the barn. He did not discard them. He turned and started walking, not toward the cabin, but toward the creek, toward the stand of trees where he knew she often gathered firewood in the evenings. He was coming to find her. Ruth's heart began to hammer against her ribs. She felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to run, to hide, but she stood her ground on the cabin porch, watching him disappear into the growing darkness of the trees. He had accepted her gift. Now he was coming for an answer. The wind was picking up again, the same restless southern wind from the afternoon. It whispered through the pines on the mountainside and sighed through the cottonwood leaves. It was a wild, lonely sound. Ruth pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, took a deep breath, and walked off the porch to gather the last of the wood for the night. She would meet him halfway. She would not hide. She was bent over, her arms full of fallen branches. When he found her, the wind was stronger here, away from the shelter of the cabin. It pressed her worn dress against her legs and whipped loose strands of her hair across her face. She felt his presence before she saw him, a sudden stillness in the air that was not the wind. She straightened up. Turning slowly, he was standing a few feet away, a tall, dark shape against the moonlit grass. He was no longer holding the flowers. He stepped closer, into a patch of moonlight that filtered through the trees. His face was in shadow, his expression unreadable, but his eyes seemed to hold the silver of the moon. He reached out, not to take the wood from her, but to place his hands gently on her shoulders. His touch was warm and firm, a grounding weight that seemed to still the frantic beating of her heart. The wood she was holding pressed into her chest, a rough, physical barrier between them. He looked down at her, and the wind swirled around them, a living, breathing presence. A gust caught the hem of her skirt, making it flutter and dance around her ankles. A shiver, sharp and sudden, ran through her. It was not from the cold. His voice, when he spoke, was a low murmur, almost lost in the sound of the wind, still shaking. The question hung between them, a perfect, fragile echo of that first night under the stars. He was not asking about the wind. He was asking about the fear, about the ghosts, about the trembling girl who had clung to him in the dark. She looked up into his shadowed face, into the quiet intensity of his gaze, and gave him the only answer she could, the honest one. She nodded, a small, single movement. Yes, a part of me always will be. A small, sad smile touched his lips, a fleeting expression of such profound understanding it took her breath away. He leaned in, his mouth close to her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "Then hold me again." The words were not a plea, they were a remedy, the same one he had offered before, an anchor, a task, and this time they were an invitation. A laugh, sudden and surprised, escaped her lips. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated relief, a laugh that acknowledged the beautiful, impossible circularity of it all. She let the firewood tumble from her arms, where it fell with a soft clatter to the ground at their feet. The barrier was gone. She did as he said. She raised her arms and wrapped them around his neck, her fingers tangling in the thick hair at his nape. She pressed herself against him, holding on tight. His arms came around her waist, pulling her closer, until there was no space, no air, no wind between them. He was solid and warm and real. He lowered his head, and she lifted hers. It was not clumsy. It was not rushed. It was the slow, inevitable meeting of two solitary souls who had finally found their harbor. His lips were firm, chapped by the wind, and they tasted of coffee and wood smoke and the clean, wild air of the valley. It was a kiss of profound stillness, a long, quiet moment of acknowledgement in the heart of the blowing wind. It was not a beginning, but a recognition of a truth that had been growing between them all along, as quiet and as steadfast as the mountains themselves. The kiss under the wind-tossed trees had not been an ending, but a quiet beginning. It was a seal on an unspoken pact, an acknowledgement of the fragile, powerful thing that had grown between them in the silent valley. The weeks that followed were filled with a sense of gentle purpose, a shared rhythm that felt as natural as the turning of the seasons. Autumn deepened its hold on the high country, painting the aspens on the mountainsides in strokes of brilliant gold and turning the morning air sharp and clean in their lungs. Their home was no longer a ruin. The roof was sound, the door was solid, and the cabin was a haven of warmth against the increasingly chilly nights. Jed had taught Ruth how to use a small hand axe, and she took pride in her ability to split kindling. The clean, sharp crack of the wood, a satisfying sound. He showed her how to read the tracks of deer and rabbits near the creek, and how to spot the subtle signs of a coming change in the weather. In return, she brought a softness to the harsh edges of his world. She mended the tears in his shirt with neat, careful stitches, and she learned to make a savory stew that could last them for days. She even managed to coax the wild hen and her new brood of chicks into a repaired coop, her patience a force more effective than any of Jed's practicality. There was an ease between them now, a language that flowed in the spaces between words, a shared glance across the fire, the way he would place a cup of hot coffee in her hands in the morning without being asked, the way she would have a hot meal waiting for him when he came in from a long day of reinforcing the corral fences. They were two solitary people who, in the process of rebuilding a home, were quietly rebuilding each other. The past, however, was not a ghost that could be banished so easily. It was a patient predator, and it had a long memory. The attack came on a moonless, starless night. A thick blanket of clouds had rolled in at dusk, swallowing the familiar peaks of the mountains and pressing down on the valley with a heavy, muffling silence. A cold, damp wind had sprung up, rattling the wooden shutter Jed had built for the single window and making the fire in the hearth hiss and spit. An owl hooted from the darkness of the cottonwoods, its call a lonely, mournful sound. Jed was restless. Ruth had noticed it all evening. He had cleaned and oiled his Colt, then his rifle, with a slow, meticulous attention that seemed more like a ritual than a chore. He had walked the perimeter of the homestead twice after sundown, Samson trotting nervously at his heels, his head up, his ears twitching. "Just the wind," he had said when he came back inside, his voice a low rumble, but his eyes, as he stared into the fire, were distant and hard. He knew this land, its sounds and silences, and some deep, primal instinct was telling him that something was wrong. Ruth was darning one of his socks by the firelight when they heard it. It was not a loud sound. It was a single, sharp crack of a twig breaking under a heavy boot, just beyond the edge of the clearing. It was a sound that did not belong to the wind, or to any four-legged creature of the night. Instantly, Jed was on his feet. He moved with a silent, fluid grace that was terrifying. One moment he was by the fire, the next he was at the door, his hand already on the heavy wooden bar he had fitted across it. He put a single finger to his lips, his eyes locking with hers. The message was clear. Silence. He blew out the single lantern that lit the cabin, plunging the room into near total darkness, save for the faint, flickering glow of the fire. Ruth's heart, which had been beating in a calm, steady rhythm, began to hammer against her ribs. A wild, trapped bird. She stayed frozen where she was, the sock and needle falling from her numb fingers. Another sound came from the darkness, a low, gravelly chuckle, then a voice, amplified by the night's stillness, that turned her blood to ice. "We know you're in there, Boone, and we know who you've got with you." It was the voice of the big man from the way station, the leader, and the sound of it, here, in their sanctuary, was the most profound violation she could imagine. "She gave my man Eli a bit of trouble back in town," the voice continued, laced with a cruel, mocking amusement. "We've come to collect on the debt, send the girl out, and we might just let you walk away from this pretty little valley of yours." Jed said nothing. He stood by the door, a statue carved from shadow and fury. He drew his Colt from its holster, the soft shush of the leather an impossibly loud sound in the charged silence. From her place on the floor, Ruth could see the faint outline of the window. A shape passed by it, then another. The prompt had been right. There were more of them, many more. "Last chance," Boone the man shouted, his patience clearly wearing thin. The answer was the splintering crash of the cabin door. It didn't break open, Jed's bar was too strong for that, but a heavy axe blade smashed through the thick wood near the latch. A vicious, metallic grin in the firelight. Then another blow, and another. Wood splintered and groaned. Jed moved away from the door, pulling Ruth back with him into the deeper shadows near the hearth. "Stay down," he whispered, his voice a blade of cold steel. The door finally gave way with a screech of tortured wood and a final, shattering crack. 4 men spilled into the cabin. In the dim, chaotic light of the fire, Ruth recognized the big leader and the rat-faced Eli. 2 others, strangers with hard, cruel faces, followed them in. They were armed with axes and heavy clubs. The fight was immediate and brutal. Jed did not wait for them to advance. He met them in the center of the room, a whirlwind of controlled violence. The first man, one of the strangers, swung a club, and Jed moved under it, his fist connecting with the man's jaw with a sickening, wet crunch. The man went down in a heap. But the odds were impossible. Eli and the other stranger came at him from the sides, while the leader, a massive, shadowy figure, circled around. It wasn't a fight. It was an ambush. A club caught Jed high on the shoulder, and he grunted in pain. Stumbling a step, he brought his Colt up and fired, the explosion deafening in the enclosed space. The second stranger screamed and clutched his leg, falling to the floor. But the shot had given the leader the opening he needed. While Jed was still recovering his balance, the big man lunged forward from the side, a heavy, dark shape, moving with surprising speed. He wasn't holding a weapon. In his hand was a large, flat rock he must have scooped up from the path outside. He brought it down in a vicious, sweeping arc against the side of Jed's head. The sound was a dull, horrifying thud. Jed went down without a cry. He collapsed like a felled tree, his long frame hitting the floorboards with a heavy, final-sounding impact. The Colt skittered from his grasp, sliding into the shadows under the table. For a single, eternal moment, the world stopped. Ruth's breath, her heart, her very soul seemed to freeze. Jed, her wall, her protector, the unshakable center of her new world, was lying motionless on the floor. Her shield was gone. The leader stood over him, breathing heavily, a triumphant, ugly grin spreading across his face. "That's the end of that," he grunted. He turned his eyes, burning with a victorious fire, toward the hearth, toward her. Now, for the girl. In that moment, something inside Ruth broke, or perhaps something was forged. The terror was a physical thing, a sheet of ice encasing her heart. But beneath it, a different fire was kindling, an incandescent, protective rage. They had invaded her home. They had hurt him. The instinct to run, the one that had governed her entire life, screamed at her to flee, to find a corner, to disappear. But there was nowhere to run, and Jed was lying on the floor. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on the stone mantelpiece above the hearth. Resting on 2 wooden pegs was the rifle. It was older than the one Jed usually carried, heavier, Caleb's rifle. He had once told her, in a rare moment of reminiscence. She had seen him clean it, but she had never seen him fire it. She didn't even know for sure if it was loaded. Eli started toward her, his rat-like face split in a leering grin. "Come on out, little Rose. Time to pay your debts." She did not run. She stood up. She reached up and took the rifle from the mantel. It was heavy, so much heavier than she had expected, and the metal was cold as death against her trembling hands. She fumbled with the mechanism, her mind a blank, white panic. She pulled back the hammer. The solid, metallic click was the loudest sound she had ever heard. Eli stopped, his grin faltering. "What do you think you're doing with that?" he sneered, but there was a new note of uncertainty in his voice. "Get away from him," Ruth said. Her own voice was a stranger to her, a low, guttural sound she did not recognize. Her hands were shaking so violently. The long barrel of the rifle was making small, spastic circles in the air. She was a leaf in a hurricane, a fragile thing about to be torn apart. But she did not lower the gun. The leader laughed, a harsh, contemptuous sound. "She's bluffing. Grab her and finish him off." One of the men the one Jed had shot in the leg was trying to pull himself up, a long knife in his hand. He began to crawl toward Jed's still form. "No!" The word was a silent scream in her soul. Ruth took a step forward. Planting her feet, she lifted the rifle, the stock clumsy and awkward against her shoulder. She closed one eye, trying to sight down the barrel as she had seen Jed do, but her tears blurred everything into a shifting, fire-lit nightmare. She saw the man with the knife, crawling, reaching. She pulled the trigger. The explosion was a physical blow, a brutal kick against her shoulder that sent a shockwave through her entire body. The cabin filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. The shot went wide, smashing into the wooden wall a foot above the crawling man's head, sending a shower of splinters raining down. It was a warning, a desperate, terrified roar. The men froze, stunned by the sheer, unexpected violence of it. In that moment of shocked silence, a groan came from the floor. Jed stirred. He pushed himself up onto one elbow, his face pale in the firelight, a dark trickle of blood running from his temple. His eyes were dazed, but they found her, standing there with the smoking rifle. The leader recovered first. "Damn you!" he roared, his face contorted with rage. He took a menacing step, not toward her, but toward Jed. "I'll kill him right in front of you." He lunged. Ruth did not have time to think. She did not have time to aim. There was only the image of that man, that threat, moving toward the one person in the world who had ever stood for her. She raised the rifle again, her entire world narrowing to that single, hateful target. She saw the broad expanse of his charging form. She pulled the trigger a second time. This shot did not miss. The heavy slug caught the man in the thigh with a sickening, wet impact. He screamed, a high, piercing sound of agony and shock, and his leg buckled beneath him. He crashed to the floor, clutching his bleeding limb, his face a mask of disbelief. The spell was broken. Jed was on his feet now, swaying but upright, the knife from his belt now in his hand. Eli and the first man, who had recovered from Jed's initial blow, looked from their wounded, screaming leader to Jed's grim, bloody face, and then to the small, trembling woman holding the long rifle, the woman who was not bluffing. The fight went out of them. It was replaced by the panicked, primal urge of predators who had suddenly found themselves outmatched. Eli grabbed his wounded leader under the arms and began to drag him toward the shattered door. The other man, his jaw already swelling, scrambled after them. The one with the wounded leg was left to crawl out on his own. They fled into the darkness, their retreat a chaotic scramble of curses and whimpers of pain. And then they were gone. Silence descended on the cabin, a silence broken only by the crackling of the fire and the ragged, gasping sound of Ruth's own breathing. The heavy rifle slipped from her nerveless fingers and clattered to the floor. The shaking started then. It was not the small, fearful tremor of before. It was a violent, uncontrollable convulsion, a storm that seized her from the inside out. Her knees gave way, and she would have collapsed if Jed had not been there. He crossed the room in 2 long, unsteady strides and caught her, his strong arms wrapping around her, holding her up. He was bleeding. He was hurt, but he was holding her. She buried her face in his chest, her entire body shaking, racked with a force she could not contain. It was not the shaking of fear. It was the violent, physical aftermath of courage. It was the tremor of a woman who had spent her life running, and who had, in the space of a few terrifying heartbeats, finally, irrevocably, stood her ground. The storm of adrenaline and terror passed, leaving in its wake a silence that was more profound than the one that had come before it. The world seemed to rush back in with a deafening roar, the pop and hiss of the fire, the mournful sigh of the wind through the shattered door, the ragged, desperate sound of her own breathing. Jed's arms were a solid cage around her, the only fixed point in a universe that had just been torn apart and reassembled. He held her until the violent, bone-rattling shaking subsided into a series of smaller, exhausted tremors. He did not speak, did not offer empty words of comfort. He just stood, a warm, solid wall, absorbing the aftershocks of her courage. Finally, she lifted her head from his chest, her face wet with tears she hadn't realized she was crying. "Jed," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing, and then she saw him clearly in the firelight. The cut on his temple was worse than she had thought, a deep, ugly gash from which blood was still sluggishly seeping, matting his dark hair. His face, usually weathered and stoic, was pale, almost gray, beneath his tan. A muscle in his jaw was clenched tight against the pain. He had risen, he had fought, he had come to her, all while a wound that would have felled a lesser man was bleeding freely. The sight of his injury, of his vulnerability, severed the last thread of her own shock. The trembling girl who had needed his protection was gone. In her place stood a woman with a singular, ferocious purpose. "You're hurt," she said, the words simple, factual. She reached up, her fingers gently touching the skin near the wound. He flinched, a small, involuntary movement. "It's nothing," he rasped, but even as he said it, his body betrayed him. He swayed on his feet, and his weight, which he had been holding so steady, suddenly sagged against her. "No," she said, her voice firm, taking on a command she didn't know she possessed. "We need to get you down. We need to clean this." She slipped her shoulder under his arm, taking on as much of his weight as she could. He was a heavy man, all lean muscle and bone, and she staggered under the load. But she did not falter. Together, they made their slow, painful way to his bedroll, which lay undisturbed near the hearth. He collapsed onto it with a low groan, his eyes fluttering closed for a moment. For the next hour, Ruth was a creature of pure, focused intent. The ruined cabin, the lingering smell of gunpowder, the men who had fled into the night, all of it faded into the background. Her entire world shrank to the space around the man lying on the floor. She built up the fire, needing the light. She took the kettle to the creek, her legs shaking with exhaustion, and filled it, setting it on the hearth to boil, from her small sewing kit. She took the cleanest linen. She had a handkerchief she had been embroidering before her life had fallen apart. She tore it into strips for bandages. From Jed's own saddlebags, she found a small flask of whiskey. It was for drinking. She knew, but she also knew it was for cleaning wounds. She knelt beside him. His eyes were open now, watching her, dazed and clouded with pain. "This is going to hurt," she said softly, uncorking the flask. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. Then, with hands that were surprisingly steady, she began the slow, terrible work of cleaning the gash. She poured a small amount of the whiskey onto a piece of cloth, the sharp, alcoholic scent filling the air. As she gently dabbed at the wound, his entire body went rigid, a low hiss of pain escaping through his clenched teeth. But he did not cry out. She worked with a meticulous, gentle focus, cleaning away the blood and grime, her touch as light as she could make it. The wound was deep, but clean. It would heal, if she could keep it from festering. When she was done, she bandaged his head with the linen strips, her movements sure and practiced. She had tended to scrapes and cuts on her younger brothers. But this was different. This was not a childhood mishap. This was a matter of life and death, and the weight of it settled on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a mantle of responsibility she accepted without question. She brought him water, holding the cup to his lips. Then she took a blanket and covered him. He was already slipping into a feverish, restless state, muttering words she could not understand. She sat beside him, a silent vigil in the ruined cabin, and watched him breathe. The hunter, The protector was now the patient. The runner was now the guardian. The roles had been reversed, and in that reversal, a new, unbreakable bond was forged. The days that followed blurred into a timeless cycle of care. Jed's wound, as she had feared, became infected. He was lost to a fever that left him shivering one moment and burning the next. He tossed and turned, lost in a dark, private wilderness of pain and memory, sometimes calling out a name, Caleb, in a voice thick with a sorrow so deep it made Ruth's own heart ache. During those long days and even longer nights, Ruth did not leave his side. She became the keeper of his life. She kept the fire going, a constant, warm heartbeat in the center of the cabin. She boiled water and forced broth, thin and hot, between his cracked lips when he was lucid enough to swallow. She bathed his face and chest with cool, damp cloths. Fighting the fever with the only weapons she had, she learned the rhythms of his illness, the moments of deepest crisis, the brief, fleeting periods of calm. She was exhausted, her body a single, continuous ache, but she did not stop. She moved through the cabin like a ghost, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. She repaired the shattered door as best she could, wedging a piece of the broken table against it to keep out the wind. She swept away the splinters of wood. She was not just tending to him. She was defending their sanctuary, reclaiming it from the violence that had defiled it. On the morning of the fourth day, as a pale, watery sunlight filtered into the cabin, she was kneeling by the hearth, stirring a thin porridge of cornmeal and water, when a small, hesitant knock came at the damaged door. Her blood ran cold. She froze, her hand gripping the iron spoon like a weapon. They had come back. But the voice that called out was not a man's. It was a boy's, high and clear. "Mr. Boone, you in there? I brought you some milk." Slowly, cautiously, Ruth moved to the door and peered through a crack. A boy of about 10 or 11 stood on the porch, holding a small wooden bucket. He was thin and wiry, with a thatch of sun-bleached hair and a smattering of freckles across his nose. He was dressed in worn but clean overalls, and his feet were bare, his soles tough as leather. There was a self-sufficiency about him, a quiet competence that spoke of a life lived without much supervision. She opened the door. The boy took a step back, his eyes wide with surprise. He had clearly been expecting Jed. Who are you?" he asked, clutching his bucket. "My name is Ruth," she said softly, not wanting to frighten him. "Mr. Boone is unwell." The boy's gaze shifted past her, into the dim interior of the cabin, where he could see Jed's form lying by the fire. A look of genuine concern crossed his young face. "Is he hurt bad?" "He's resting," Ruth said, the words an inadequate summary of the life-and-death struggle happening inside. "Who are you?" "I'm Tom," he said. "I live over the ridge. Jed, Mr. Boone, he lets me keep my goat here sometimes. Says the grass is better." Ruth remembered Jed mentioning a neighbor, a boy living on his own since his PA had died in a mining accident the year before. This had to be him. Tom held out the bucket. "It's fresh. Thought he might like some." The simple, unprompted kindness of it, coming after so much brutality, nearly broke her. She took the bucket, her throat too tight to speak. "Thank you, Tom. That's very kind." The boy lingered, his bare toes digging into the dirt. Can I help with anything? I'm good with wood. And I can fetch water." And so, a new routine was born. Tom became a daily visitor, a small, quiet ray of sunshine in the grim reality of the sick room. He would arrive each morning with his bucket of goat's milk and would wordlessly set about doing the chores he knew needed doing. He would split kindling into a neat, perfect pile. He would haul water from the creek, his thin arms surprisingly strong. He never asked too many questions, never intruded. He would simply do his work, give Ruth a shy, quick smile, and then disappear back over the ridge as evening approached. One afternoon, he arrived not just with milk, but with his hands full of late-season wildflowers, their colors muted by the autumn chill. They were mostly tough, hardy asters and the last of the yarrow. He came into the cabin, his usual shyness overcome by a clear purpose. He walked over to where Jed lay sleeping and, with a gentleness that was startling in a boy his age, he laid the small bouquet on the edge of the bedroll, right beside Jed's pillow. Jed's fever had finally broken that morning. He was no longer lost in delirium, but lay in a state of deep, healing exhaustion. His eyes were closed, but his breathing was even and steady for the first time in days. Ruth was sitting on the floor nearby, watching over him. She saw Tom's small act of grace, and her heart swelled. This valley, this home, was not just a place of pain and survival. It was a place of kindness. Tom looked at her, his face serious. "Ma always said flowers help folks get better." He left soon after, leaving the scent of crushed leaves and wild things in the air. Ruth looked from the small, brave bouquet to the pale, sleeping face of the man who had saved her, the man she, in turn, had fought for. Everything she had been, everything she had thought she was, had been burned away in the crucible of the past week. She was no longer a frightened girl defined by the things she had fled. A deep sense of peace, a feeling of profound and absolute certainty, settled over her. She knew, with a clarity that was as real as the wooden floor beneath her, that her journey was over. She was not in redemption, but she had found it nonetheless. She leaned forward, her voice a murmur, a quiet confession made to the sleeping man and to the universe itself. "I used to run," she said softly. "Not anymore." As she spoke the words, a hand moved. It was Jed's. His eyes fluttered open, not clouded with fever, but clear and lucid. They found hers. He had heard her. Slowly, with a strength that was still faint but deeply resolute, he lifted his hand from the blanket. He did not speak. He did not need to. He simply reached for her. She placed her hand in his. His fingers, calloused and rough, closed around hers. It was not a weak grip. It was a firm, deliberate, and powerful clasp. It was the first time he had ever held her hand. It was a gesture that said everything he could not. It said, "I heard you. I see you. I am here." In that tight, warm grasp, an entire future was promised. There were no vows, no grand declarations. There was only the silent, unshakable truth of his hand holding hers. It was not the hand of a stranger offering aid. It was the hand of a partner, a protector, a man who was, in his own quiet way, promising to never let go. And Ruth, holding on just as tightly, promised the very same thing. She was home. The hand that had held hers in the firelight became her anchor in the days of healing that followed. Jedediah Boone was not a man accustomed to stillness or to weakness, and his recovery was a battle fought with a quiet, stubborn ferocity. The deep gash on his temples slowly began to mend, leaving a stark, angry scar that would forever alter the rugged landscape of his face. His strength returned not in a flood, but like a slow tide, a little more each day. In the beginning, he was a reluctant patient. He would try to rise too soon, his jaw set, his pride warring with the fever's lingering weakness. And Ruth, with a gentleness that was as unyielding as his own will, would press him back down. "Not yet," she would say, her voice soft but firm, and he, with a flicker of frustration in his gray eyes, would obey. He was a man who knew how to command, but he was learning, with a grudging grace, how to be cared for. As his strength returned, the dynamic in the cabin shifted again. She was no longer just his nurse. They were partners in reclamation, their focus expanding from his own healing to the healing of the land around them. The first day, he was able to stand on his own for more than a few minutes. They stood together on the porch, a cold, sharp wind whipping down from the mountains, a harbinger of the coming winter. They looked out at the valley, at the work that still needed to be done. "The fences," he said, his voice still rough. Need to be strengthened before the first snow. Keep the cattle from wandering. Keep the wolves out. And so, the work began anew. But this time, they worked side by side. Mending the fences was a slow, arduous task. Jed, his movements still careful, would dig the post holes and set the heavy timber, his muscles protesting but slowly remembering their old strength. Ruth, her hands now calloused and capable, would stretch the wire, pulling it taut, her small frame braced against the strain. They worked in a comfortable, efficient silence, each anticipating the other's needs. He would hold the post steady while she hammered in the staples, her blows sure and even. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of her hammer against the wood was a new kind of music in the valley, a song of rebuilding, of creating a boundary that was not a cage, but a circle of safety. They were not just keeping things out, they were making a space to hold things in. Tom, their small, shy visitor, became a permanent fixture in their lives. He would appear over the ridge each morning, his arrival as reliable as the sunrise, and would fall into the day's work without needing to be asked. He was a quiet, observant boy, and he watched Jed with a kind of reverent awe, mimicking the way he held a hammer, the way he tested the tension on a wire. Jed, in turn, took the boy under his wing. He never spoke to him of his father, never offered words of pity for his solitude. Instead, he offered him the far greater gift of purpose. He taught him how to carve a clean notch in a log, how to tie a knot that would never slip, how to read the clouds to tell if a storm was coming. They were lessons in survival, taught not with lectures, but with shared labor. A man passing on the hard-won knowledge of the world to a boy who would need it. While the men worked on the larger structures, Ruth turned her attention to the earth itself. On the sheltered, sunny side of the cabin, she marked out a small plot for a garden. Jed had turned the soil for her with a shovel, his first real act of heavy labor since the attack, and the sight of the dark, rich earth, a promise of life waiting for the spring, had filled her with a quiet, fierce joy. She planted what she could, hardy root vegetables that would hopefully survive the winter underground potatoes, onions and carrots she had bought with the last of her mother's silver buttons on that fateful trip to Prosperity Wells. Kneeling in the dirt, her hands buried in the cool, crumbly soil, Ruth felt a sense of belonging so profound it was almost a physical ache. She was no longer a rootless, fleeing thing. She was planting herself, here in this valley. The small, domestic acts of their life together became the foundation of their new world. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, the cabin filled with the smell of roasting potatoes and wood smoke. They would share a skillet of cornbread, breaking off pieces with their hands, the simple act of sharing a meal a sacrament. They took turns hauling water from the creek, the weight of the buckets a shared and therefore lighter burden. One afternoon, the three of them were sitting on the porch steps, taking a rest from their work. The sun was warm, and a lazy peace had settled over the valley. Tom, with the intense concentration of a boy on a mission, was trying to make a whistle from a blade of grass. Just as Jed had shown him, he would hold the grass taut between his thumbs and blow, producing only a soft, breathy puff of air. His face was screwed up in frustration. "You're holding it too loose," Jed said, his voice a low rumble. He leaned over, his large, scarred hand gently adjusting the boy's smaller ones. "Like this. Pull it tight, so it hums." Tom tried again. This time, a high, thin, reedy note pierced the afternoon quiet. It was a funny, off-key sound, but it was a whistle. The boy's face broke into a grin of pure, unadulterated triumph. He blew again, a series of short, happy toots. Ruth watched them, a small smile playing on her own lips. Jed was leaning back against the porch post, his long legs stretched out, his bad shoulder resting. Tom was sitting at his feet, proudly piping his new tune. In that moment, they were not a wounded man, a runaway woman, and an orphan boy. They were a family. The sight was so simple, so beautiful, and so profoundly right that it filled a space in her heart she had never known was empty. Winter came, not with a roar, but with a whisper. The first snow fell overnight, a light, delicate dusting that covered the valley in a blanket of pristine white and clung to the pine branches like powdered sugar. The world went silent, the snow absorbing every sound, creating a deep and reverent peace. The hard work was done. The fences were mended, the woodpile was high, and the cabin was snug and warm. The days grew short, the nights long. It was a time of stillness, of waiting for the earth to turn. They would spend the long evenings by the fire, Jed carving a small wooden horse for Tom, Ruth knitting a warm scarf from a ball of rough wool she had found in an old trunk. The quiet, domestic rhythm of their life was the only measure of time. One morning, Ruth woke just before dawn. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing orange coals, and the cabin was filled with a soft, gray light. Jed was already gone. She knew, without needing to be told, where he had gone. There was a high ridge on the eastern side of the valley, a place he sometimes went to be alone, Caleb's favorite spot. He had told her once. She pulled on her boots and a heavy wool shawl and stepped out onto the porch. The air was so cold it stung her cheeks and stole her breath. The snow under her feet was crisp and squeaked with every step. The sky to the east was a pale, luminous canvas of pearl and rose, the first hint of the coming sun. She looked up at the ridge and saw him, a tall, solitary figure standing against the brightening sky, as still and as permanent as the ancient pines that surrounded him. He was watching the sunrise. He was welcoming the light. She did not go to him. It was a private moment, a conversation with a memory she did not need to be a part of. She just stood there, on the porch of their home, and watched him. She felt an overwhelming wave of love for this quiet, wounded, and resilient man, a love as deep and as steadfast as the mountains themselves. After a long time, he turned and started down the path toward the cabin. As he walked, the sun finally broke free of the horizon, spilling a wave of brilliant, golden light across the snow-covered valley. It was a new day, a new beginning. He saw her standing on the porch, waiting for him. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and just looked at her. The morning sun caught in her hair, turning the simple brown strands into a halo of fire. The hem of her simple wool dress brushed against the snow-dusted porch boards. Her face, which had been so pale and haunted when he had first seen her, was now calm and filled with a quiet, luminous strength. She was beautiful, not with the fragile, polished beauty of the city she had left behind, but with the fierce, elemental beauty of a wild flower that had found a place to bloom in the harshest of soils. And as he looked at her, standing there in the morning light, the mistress of his brother's house, the guardian of his own heart, something shifted in his face. It was a slow, quiet transformation. The hard, stoic lines around his mouth, carved there by a lifetime of loss and solitude, seemed to soften. A warmth crept into his cool, gray eyes, a light that had nothing to do with the rising sun. And then, for the very first time, Jedediah Boone smiled. It was not a wide grin, not a laugh. It was a simple, profound lifting at the corners of his mouth, a quiet expression of a peace so deep it had no need for sound. It was the smile of a man who had finally, after a long and brutal winter of the soul, come home. The sight of it, so unexpected and so beautiful, made Ruth's breath catch in her throat. It was the most precious gift he had ever given her. It made her feel so safe, so completely and utterly cherished, that it gave her the courage to voice the last, faintest whisper of the ghost she had once been. She took a step toward him, her voice a soft murmur in the cold, still air. "What if I shake again?" He mounted the steps and came to stand before her. He reached out, not to his gun, not to his knife, but to her. He cupped her face in his warm, calloused hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. He looked down at her, and his smile did not fade. It deepened. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, his voice a low, rough promise that was meant only for her. "Then hold me," he whispered, "and don't let go." Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below and share your thoughts with our community. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and consider supporting us further by hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.